So as we dive into the global chapter, let's or start with some questions to let you get a sense of just how important this whole issue of global is. So Nestle, N-E-S-T-L-E-S, Nestle's makes the very best chocolate. Sorry for the singing. Where's it headquartered? Switzerland. It's a Swiss company. How about Coca-Cola? What percentage of Coca-Cola's sales occur outside the United States of America? Answer obviously varies from year to year, but a pretty safe number is about 75%. How about Boeing? We talked about the case of the 787 in the previous video. They've sold or have orders for over 1,000 airplanes. How many of U.S.-based airlines bought? A little over 200. So you can see that the majority of their sales are worldwide. And lastly, a company that's getting a lot of attention right now, as I make this video, and we may be able to integrate into some of our discussions later in the course, is InBev. They bought the American icon beer firm Anheuser-Busch several years ago. Where is InBev headquartered? That's a particularly tricky question because InBev itself is a Brazilian company that bought some European brands of beer, so they chose to headquarter their company in Belgium. And now, when they bought Anheuser-Busch, they were headquartered in Belgium, and that's still where the overall corporate headquarters is. So you can see it's a very global world. And I'm going to tell you a bit of a history story just so you can appreciate how different the world that you're graduating into is than the world that I graduated into more years ago than we're going to talk about. When I graduated, there was the Soviet Union with its communist form of government. There was a totally closed China that was a world unto itself, and then you had free markets in other parts of the world, and you saw this battle between the Soviet Union and the United States. And then in the 1980s and early 1990s, that question was settled. Capitalism was the way to go. That's getting a little bit of pressure now because you see the rise of the China system where they say, yes, free markets, but heavily centrally controlled. So the unanimity on this question is beginning to wane a little bit, and we'll talk about that in some of the global issues. What it costs to move things, long distances went down. The big air cargo carriers like UPS and FedEx and others crossing the globes each night with airplanes, they didn't exist. The large shipping fleets didn't exist. They do now, and it's much cheaper to ship. Likewise, communication cost. Very briefly, I'll tell you a story. In early 1990, I was stationed in northern Japan in the Air Force. When we would call our families, it would cost us basically $1.25 a minute to call our families. And it was more expensive if they dialed us. Went to the same location 10 years later, and it had gone from $1.25 a minute to 10 cents a minute. I was then, just a couple of years later, stationed in Tokyo, Japan, and it cost us a nickel a minute to call from Japan to the United States. So you see how quickly the communications costs were slashed, and then we also have the rise of the internet. And so now we can transfer information worldwide. A current hiccup, again, as I make the video, there's some issues about the European Union and no longer accepting data sharing provisions with the United States that could put some wrinkles in this. The last thing I want to get this point out on the table earlier, we talk about a global world, and for a lot of companies, particularly the ones we're going to talk about today, it is. For a lot of other businesses, though, it's really a regional world. They go into certain parts of the globe where there's similar culture, similar taste for product, something like that, where their things are more similar to their home market than different because they find those sorts of markets easier to penetrate. So even though we speak of a global world, for a lot of companies, it's a regional world. And lastly, the graphic on the right part of the slide shows you that if you want to have larger markets, you have to go global. This slide, I want you to emphasize, or I want you to see, talks about the rise of the global economy. Literally, China's line is zero until 1975 or 1976. That's where it jumps off. It goes until 1976, China exported nothing. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to find the same data source to update this, but other data sources I tapped into says that today, 2015, China is the leading exporter in the world in terms of value. So you can see that this is very much a global economy. So given that it's a global economy and you choose to play in that, I'm going to organize the information a little bit differently than the textbook chapter. I'm going to organize it in what I consider to be the big questions. Where are you going to penetrate and sell? And to some of that, we've already discussed that in the previous two slides. Who's got the market that you're looking for? And are you comfortable, just how comfortable are you with reaching out? Do you really need to focus on regions, or are you ready to go global? Using what product mix? Manufactured where, and the company uses the term arbitrage, and I'm going to make that even simpler in a later slide. Under what organization? And we're going to touch on that in this chapter, but we're going to talk about it more later in the organizational chapter. Using what entry strategy, and then we're going to close with what are the risks of this idea of going global. The textbook talks about Porter's diamond. It's a wonderful discussion. It's an interesting concept. I frankly think a little bit of it's become overcome by 20 years of globalization. But the main thing I want you to get out of that is, what did Porter say tended to make for a successful global company? One that had faced significant rivals early in its founding. And so the idea, if you had to become a good fighter in your first market, then you're likely to be a good fighter when you go out into other markets. I find that not surprising, but still interesting. This is a slide from another textbook, but I think it takes a lot of the mishmash in our textbook and makes it very clear. I'm going to make it even clearer. There are really two basic reasons why companies go global. They want to sell more stuff, and they want to be able to make the product cheaper. And there's all sorts of ways where that becomes a factor. You'll notice, again, this is out of another textbook because it's a cleaner slide. There's no circle in the bottom right-hand quadrant, where in our textbook it talks about an international strategy where there's low need for local responsiveness and low idea of cost control or global integration. I just don't think that represents many markets enough anymore that it's worth talking about. So I'm going to stop here. We'll dive into the particulars of these strategies in just a few minutes.